Welcome to the forum at Holy Communion. My name is Mike. I am one of the priests. And today I am joined by Dr. Rachel Penczykowski. And we are talking about ecology and creation and disease. And I'm going to let you introduce yourself a little bit, Rachel. But by way of that, I want to ask you a question about we asked you to join and you graciously agreed to join our pandemic task force after I had a couple conversations with you early in COVID about disease. And I don't think I knew exactly what your title was, but you studied disease ecology. And what does that mean? And how are diseases related to ecology?
This is a great question. So ecology in the broadest sense is just the branch of biology studying how organisms interact with each other and interact with their environments. And so disease ecology is just the study of how diseases interact with other organisms, including host organisms and other disease-causing agents. I and many disease ecologists think about infectious diseases including very diverse types of organisms, from viruses, bacteria, fungi, all the way to parasitic worms. Usually different people specialize in different types of disease-causing organisms, but many of the processes can be studied and compared between different disease systems, which is always interesting. And so, yeah.
No, I was going to say that's been really interesting because you specialize kind of in plants, yeah?
Mm-hmm. So many disease ecologists also work in what we call model systems. And so these are systems you might have heard of, model systems like fruit flies for many types of molecular and genetic studies. Mouse model systems are also widely used in biology. And in disease ecology, a model system could be whatever is a species or a pair of species, being at least one host and one pathogen or parasite, that can be really useful for answering questions about ecology and or evolution of disease in different contexts. And so different model systems might be appropriate to different types of diseases, but typically you want to work with a system that's going to be tractable for the questions involved, and ideally also ethical, right? So there's a reason why people use mouse models over primate models of human diseases. And so in my lab, we primarily work with plants as our model host organisms, and especially we work with really common weedy plants that, like all free living organisms, get infected with things. And one of the things that our favorite common weedy plants get infected with is a fungus. It's a powdery mildew fungus. And we use this system as a model in part because it's really common and really abundant, really easy to find. And this infection you can see reliably on the outside of the leaf. You don't even have to dissect anything or necessarily do any lab-based molecular analyses to tell if something is infected or not. And there's really nice obvious symptoms, and then we can work with it quite easily in the greenhouse and the lab. And we can study how the disease transmits, we can ask questions about when and where hosts of the same species are infected and when and where they're not. We can look at how strains of this pathogen evolve to adapt to hosts in a given place or adapt to, say, the climate in a given place. And then we can also expand out. And I think some of the really interesting disease ecology maybe starts with a given focal host and pathogen, and that transmission to other host species, or looks at how co-infection with multiple pathogens at the same time matters, or how the microbiome associated with the host impacts the probability of disease, or looks at how predation on the host either enhances or decreases the transmission of disease through the population.
Yeah, it's interesting. As we've been talking about the pandemic for 18 months now, and I think if we had had this conversation early on, all sorts of topics of knowledge that I've now read multiple not peer reviewed, but like news articles about what you just said in terms of, mutation, and in terms of how diseases interact with their hosts. Like, but just as a society, we've had to learn a lot more about these things in recent days. And you've been thinking about them for a long time. We'll come back around to pandemic and those questions, but I want to start a little bit. So we're doing 3 weeks at Holy Communion of what is a longer season in the church that is one of the newer seasons. It came from the World Council of Churches, and it looks at creation, but it was particularly started by the ecumenical patriarch, the head of the Orthodox Church, to raise awareness about climate change and human-driven climate change. So what are some signs in the world of disease around human-driven climate change? Like, how does that interact with the work that you do?
Yeah, so I would say from the human-centered perspective that many of us are deeply concerned about, some of the most well-documented changes have to do with changes in the geographic distribution of vectors of disease. So things like mosquitoes and ticks that are found in places where they didn't used to be able to live because of climate conditions changing. And so then the question is, now that this vector is here, does the pathogen that sometimes hitches a ride with this vector, can it also persist in this new place? And is this going to pose a risk to human populations? And so we're definitely seeing shifts in vector distributions. And I also think about in my own work with plants and pathogens, how climate is changing the length of the growing season. The amount of sunlight is staying the same, but the climatic conditions appropriate for growth of the plant and the pathogen are shifting. And so kind of one of the understudied parts of the year in terms of climate change is winter. And in places with historically cold winters, there's a whole lot we don't know about what pathogens do to survive the winter, and how a lack of winter with climate change or a change in winter conditions, whether that means just wetter but not as much snow, or just simply warmer overall, how those changes are impacting the full life cycle of pathogens and parasites in the environment or in their hosts.
Missourians, when it's a particularly cold winter with a lot of freezes, like to tell themselves there will be less mosquitoes the following summer, kind of thing. Yeah. So,
and then, another really important facet of climate change, though, is that, we know that excessive heat and drought, these types of temperature and water-related things can really affect the overall stress, physiological stress of an organism, and may make some host organisms just more vulnerable to disease. So there've been some well-documented die-offs of, coral in the Caribbean, linked to excessive heat, coupled with pathogens. Sometimes the pathogen is not completely figured out yet, but this pairing of stress from climate change, physiological stress plus disease, can be especially troublesome. And we're even seeing that, of course, as humans in this COVID pandemic, how problematic it is when we have an infectious disease coupled with, whether it's a hurricane or an excessive cold snap in a place that doesn't normally have such cold, or excessive heat. This impacts our behaviors in ways that may not align with what we need to do to keep ourselves safe from infection.
Let alone, ongoing systemic inequalities.
Absolutely.
that we've seen across that people who generally have better health indicators tend to do better in a pandemic, and they
also do better under weather-related disasters. Exacerbated by climate change.
Yeah. So I quoted the Archbishop of Canterbury, Pope, and ecumenical patriarch around that in my sermon. One thing that I put myself out there on, and I'm sort of partly checking, but from a theological perspective, this is important. This idea that the earth, like the Anthropocene, is not something that the Bible contemplates. So this is a new thing for us ethically, this idea that human beings are affecting the whole climate. But one of the things that I said on Sunday was that the Earth is surprisingly resilient. And it made me nervous saying that with a bunch of bio and ecology PhDs in the congregation, but I'm sort of checking my work afterwards. But what would you say about resiliency? I meant it theologically, but from biology, how do we talk about resiliency?
Yeah, this is a really big and important topic. I would say that in many ways, the Earth is surprisingly resilient, and ecosystems can be quite resilient, where a small shock to the system kind of fades out rapidly. Maybe there's a brief kind of what we would say perturbation to the system, but maybe there's kind of small compensations in the dynamics of certain other organisms or processes. But there are limits to this.
Mm,
And as we know, with problems like mass extinctions and tipping points in eutrophication of lakes, where you can pump loads of phosphorus as runoff from agriculture into a given lake for years and years, but still have more or less the same lake that you always knew in terms of clear water, that the algae is getting gobbled up by these creatures who are getting gobbled up by these, who are getting gobbled up by these, and rooted plants anchoring the sediment. But there can be, in some systems, tipping points where now you've pushed just enough nutrients into the system that those dynamics no longer are able to buffer the change, and you can have a very different ecosystem after that.
yeah.
So that would be
Yeah.
one example, right? And we know about beautiful coral reefs that are now like coated in macroalgae,
Yeah.
um, or soil that is just completely changed in its structure and nutrient composition and microbial composition from intensive farming practices.
And that's some of what that big scary UN report this summer was contemplating, right? Is that and it maybe was thinking about human activity and water movement and things more directly than biology, but that there are sort of centigrade degree tipping points out there that's why that it's still worthwhile, even though we're already where we are, that trying to move for particular goals matters because of system failures, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think it's really hard for human beings to have that really big picture context. And we're used to, and in many cases, folks are um, really have to think moment to moment, day by day, just to get through this thing called life. And
Yeah.
so we kind of carry on the way we always have as societies. And so it's hard to imagine how, well, maybe things are changing very slowly, but things will just continue changing super gradually and it won't matter. But there
Yeah.
are these tipping points that we need to be wary of.
Well, and we sort of are, I don't know. I mean, emotionally, I mean, like we talk about biological and scientific tipping points. I think for a number of folks, this summer was in a way a tipping point, at least in terms of the way attention culturally, attention was given to, and the way that fires were changing the living conditions. And it, we've hit a point where that old postal service song about we think about climate change as just being rewarded for good behavior, and now we can swim every day in December. That we've shifted from that kind of mentality of the early aughts where climate change was this kind of joke culturally to like a significant, and we're actually thinking about what it's going to cost to continue doing life this way. All right. So coming back to our current pandemic, is there a potential relationship between this pandemic, potential other pandemics, and climate change and ecology? Like, is there? I've heard about, like, there's all sorts of political debate over where did the pandemic come from this time, but how does the current pandemic play ecologically?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there's pretty widespread agreement that, this SARS-CoV-2 virus came from through a natural pathway by which a wildlife host encountered a human and infected it at least once, or at least in at least one case this happened. And it will probably take some time before that's fully resolved. But what we do know is that human alteration of of landscapes, alters patterns of wildlife movement and wildlife resource use. And as that kind of human-wildlife interface changes, that alters the probability that these types of spillover events can occur. We also know that human movement patterns for trade and other reasons make it very likely that diseases can then move around the world. And I would say that none of that is surprising, right? Like, people have predicted spillover of potentially devastating viruses into the human population. It's happened before. We've known this was happening. I think what is surprising is just how terribly most nations on Earth responded in terms of not doing the most common sense and effective strategies to mitigate the spread of disease, and really folks not wanting to have even a momentary change of plans, not to be not inconvenienced by things like staying home or wearing masks when it could have really mattered a whole lot. Yeah. So I think that, so human alteration of landscapes, but also I think something that has also been really laid bare in this pandemic is how our healthcare infrastructure is so lacking in integration and ability to meet the needs of people. And so I think really nothing about this pandemic or about one thing that also any disease ecologist could have told you is that with enough cases circulating in the human population, you're going to get evolution of more infectious strains or variants. And so this Delta variant is absolutely not at all surprising. And if we keep up enough virus in the population, there will be new variants that also are slightly better at transmitting from host to host. So again, I think most of the things that have played out during this pandemic from a kind of modeling perspective have been really unsurprising, but what is surprising is kind of the human element and the lack of cooperation within and between groups of people.
Yeah. No, there's one of the kind of public health people that I've been following for a long time, because he dabbles in theology, is Paul Farmer. And he was part of a big press release this summer looking at the need for the US and other, like wealthy nations to prioritize billions of dollars into vaccine, not just development, but vaccine distribution around the world. And that that we have to actually say that is sort of, and that people have to fight for that is sort of stunning.
Yeah, like there's this, have you ever played the board game Pandemic?
Yeah.
So the idea was it was this cooperative game where everyone is trying to squash the pandemic. And I feel that that's like now a very vintage and anachronistic game, because one, it's not a game, but also two, apparently the world is not playing it as a cooperative game. There's a lot of resource hoarding and lack of responsibility taking.
Yeah, the way you win that game is generally by building more study and vaccination creation centers in various countries so that you can hop to them and fix things. Yeah, no, it's difficult. And to think about that as an ecological failure, like we are failing to cooperate, is an interesting thing to do. If you were going to prioritize, pandemic, we've talked a little bit, but changes we could be making in terms of our response to ecology, there's just so many out there, and but how would you prioritize them?
Well, I guess one thing I really like about my job as a basic scientist is that it's not my job to prioritize them. It's a whole other field or multiple fields. So, I would say lack of reliance or lessening our reliance on fossil fuels has been the big one for a very long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah. And I think also making sure that the entities who are doing the most damage to our Earth are the ones that are focused on. So of course we know that big corporations and entire industries do the bulk of the damage in terms of modification of landscape, use of water, and consumption and use of fossil fuels with resulting emissions. And so yes, every human has some role to play in this. But it's not as simple as just individual households taking out their recycling or biking to work. It's a much bigger problem.
Yeah, no, it's not just, and that's part of the it's the preview for Sunday in terms of my preaching. But the decisions we make corporately at the governmental and at the level of our consumption and the level of our workplace tend to matter a lot more than our little carbon footprint and whether we're personally, I biked to work today, but that's less of we're not that we could all bike to work and it wouldn't solve the problem. What about, let's turn, I mean, like it's easy in these ecology places to get kind of doomy, gloomy. So I wanted to ask you a question that I know that not many people know that, but the other day my almost 3-year-old Silas dug up or like rediscovered and pulled out of the ground, and I put it back, the sensor that you put in our yard. But you've also got a couple of sensors at church. Can you tell us about the sensors that you're spreading around?
Sure. So I've joined a global network called Soil Temp, and it's a network of people who are all interested in microclimate, so climate at a very small scale, and in this network specifically in the soil, just below the soil surface. And so there's a group in Europe who's spearheaded this effort, and then folks in several continents of the world, at least multiple continents of the world. And my lab has about 100 of these little temperature data loggers paired in kind of sunny and shadier spots within a few dozen locations in the St. Louis region. And so we're looking specifically across an urbanization gradient. So from downtown all the way out to Eureka, where the WashU Tyson Research Center is, and then to Shaw Nature Reserve. Some are in parks where we have permission, others are in private land. But the idea is just to really get that fine scale temperature measurement under the soil and see how it maps onto coarser, like remotely sensed temperature measurements for the same place. Because we know that temperature can vary a lot over very small scales due to things like the composition of the soil, the amount of shade, distance to roads, etc. And so my lab is studying plant pathogen and plant herbivore interactions along the same urbanization gradient locally. And so it was kind of also aligned with our interests to get some good high resolution temperature data at those sites.
Yeah. And during the pandemic, I know that you've had Ziggy and Alana out like looking at moldy leaf mold and things, right? So can you talk a little bit? Okay, and there were pictures of your kids were doing stuff with slime in bathtubs in your backyard or something too. Can you talk a little bit about that?
We took work from home very literally around here. So the one thing that's nice about the ubiquity of our study system is that I can literally collect samples just right in front of our house in all the parks that we visit as a family and my kids' school. I'm that kind of weird lady crouched down and grabbing specimens wherever we go. And the kids are both really good at identifying the focal species involved, and they'll bring me samples when they go places. And so we've done a lot of sample collection, usually with them both really just asking when can we get to the playground, please. Nice. But then I had a graduate student who did a experiment where she took greenhouse grown potted plants of some known genotypes that we'd grown in the greenhouse, and she distributed them to parks along our urbanization gradient and let herbivores and pathogens do with those plants what they would for 1 week. And then she brought them all back to my driveway to record data. And so we ordinarily would have had her bring her plants, somewhere on WashU campus or at Tyson Research Center, but there were a number of logistical hurdles regarding transportation and just access to sites last summer. And the best solution we could think of was for her to bring things to my driveway, and we could kind of take turns monitoring the situation from there. And then in the end, I made my kids I offered them the opportunity to help by dumping all the old plants into big swimming pools for disposal.
That's awesome. So swimming pools, that's cool. So one of the things that there's a hymn that talks about getting lost in wonder and awe. And when I tend to think ecologically, my brain pretty quickly gets to the point where I'm just like, this is so big, I can't comprehend it. So I wanted to ask, like, is there a system out there that for you is still so big that when you teach it or when you try to like think or theorize around it, it just gets so big that you're just like either in awe or it's hard to comprehend or fun to teach?
I would say there's many things I could choose here. I think some of my favorite parts of thinking about diseases is actually kind of getting to the small and the complicated. And so, there's some old poem about how, I'm not going to try to quote it, but the idea being that everything has parasites, even parasites have parasites. And so I think hyperparasitism is a really mind-blowing topic. So parasites of parasites. We have some hyperparasites that grow on our powdery mildew infected leaves. And to us, it's at this point mostly a nuisance. We're trying to grow powdery mildew in experiments, and sometimes they're contaminated with other fungi that are killing the powdery mildew. But I think one of the truly wildest examples that I've personally worked with thus far was during postdoctoral research before coming to WashU. I was at UW-Madison working with a researcher named Tony Ives and a pea aphid system in alfalfa fields. And these pea aphids get parasitized by parasitic wasps that are really specific to pea aphids that lay their eggs in the aphids. But then aphids, the pea aphids harbor bacterial endosymbionts, so little symbiotic bacteria. Some of those endosymbionts have a virus that produces a toxin that kills the parasitic wasp eggs as they're developing. And so there are these protective bacteria because they have a virus along for the ride. And then I was specifically interested in how having these protective endosymbionts changed aphid behavior in response to wasp attacks, and whether it impact the transmission of plant viruses between plants, as aphids did or did not get sort of startled by wasps and did or did not move between plants. So it was like a virus of a bacterium in an aphid potentially altering the rate of virus transmission between plants. It didn't get very far in that project, but it was fun to think about how complicated I could possibly make it.
It's like the woman who swallowed the fly song that it just keeps going and going and going. It's like Russian dolls. Wow. Yeah. I didn't think you were going to go to parasites on parasites, but that's a fascinating kind of place. So we're going to wrap up. I would invite, we've been doing discussions at 9 o'clock in the morning between the services out on the front lawn. Anybody who wants to come talk ecology, we'd love to have you on Sunday, the 26th, to do that. Yeah, but it's a really fascinating thing. I mean, you start opening up ecology, you start opening up the relationship we have with nature, and it's pretty quick that you run into questions of ethics or questions of faith, because it has to do with, well, what ought to be or what could be, what are the possibilities here? So it's a part of science that I find really, really fascinating. And I've been incredibly grateful. I know that early on in the pandemic, we had a bunch of MDs that were learning a lot about, the time exposure and things like that matter for disease. And that's not something that they normally think about. And now these days, for the most part, the people who are plant people are going, well, we're going to let the human people, the MDs, do a lot of the decision making. But it has been an unexpected blessing of the pandemic to get to interact with you and pick your brain. And I'm just incredibly grateful for getting to know you and getting to have this conversation, but also the ongoing work you've been doing with the church as we've been trying to keep everybody safe. So thank you. We look forward to talking some more, and we hope to see some folks on Sunday.
Sounds good.
All right.